Britain has one of the longest written histories of just about any nation. Theoretically, I can trace my ancestry back more than 1,150 years to the days of Alfred the Great. Beyond that, and we enter the realm of legend and encounter heroic characters like King Arthur. There are few places in England better able to tell our early history than the ancient capital itself, Winchester. The site of Winchester has always been close to a ford across the river Itchen, used by the Celts 2,000 years ago. The Romans took over the site, and then it was abandoned for a time, before the Saxons re-established it as Winchester in the 7th century. What happened next was to turn Winchester from being just another Saxon town in Wessex into the most important city in England for nearly 4 centuries. Alfred the Great was principally responsible for Winchester's change of fortunes. Yet, when he succeeded as King of Wessex in 871, it couldn't have been at a more difficult moment. England was experiencing the might of a Danish invasion force. One by one, each of the ancient kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia and Wessex were being defeated. After Mercia fell in 874, Wessex was the only kingdom left, and when the Danes attacked 4 years later, they nearly won. Alfred was forced to retreat to the safety of Athelney, deep in the Somerset marshes. From there, Alfred plotted his revenge and eventual victory. The Danes did not attack Wessex again for another 14 years, but this time Alfred was ready. His defences, as well as his forces, were well organised, and within 4 years, the Danes finally withdrew. During those periods of relative peace, Wessex, and in particular Winchester, prospered, for it was here that Alfred established a place of government, worship and learning. Winchester became the administrative and financial centre for Alfred's and his successors' kingdom. This is where coins were minted, records kept, and the kings of Wessex held court. Now, little evidence remains from the Saxon era, but many of the functions continued long after the age of the Saxon kings. The Great Hall, for instance, is all that remains of a major castle, originally started by the Normans, but massively added to by Henry III. It was, for a long time, the seat of government and the official royal residence in Winchester. This was the home of the Treasury and Exchequer, which provided the kings with their financial means to govern. The first full record of land ownership and wealth, compiled for William the Conqueror, known as the Domesday Book, was kept here. The Great Hall was still being used in its governmental role in the 1300s, when the then kings held parliament here.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We've got unrivaled access to the world's leading historians, with hundreds of documentaries featuring everything from Boudica to the British royal family. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Real Royalty fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use code REALROYALTY at checkout.
When a fire in 1302 caused widespread damage to the old castle, the bishop's palace at Wolvesey became the preferred royal residence in Winchester. As the official residence of the bishops of Winchester, ideally located near the cathedral, Wolvesey has been in existence since the late 10th century. It was largely rebuilt in the 12th century, partly by one of the city's most powerful clerics, Henry de Blois. He was also responsible for establishing one of the earliest forms of the welfare state, the Hospital of St. Cross, the oldest almshouse in England.
Henry de Blois, Bishop of Winchester, grandson of William the Conqueror in the early 12th century, there was a lot of civil strife. And so people lost their homes, their families, their jobs. And so the place was founded for 13 poor men. I think possibly the 13 because of Christ and the 12 apostles.
So who is entitled to become a brother here?
Anyone who applies. Some similar places in other parts of the country, there's a residential qualification. For instance, you have had to have been born in the town or have lived there for a number of years. But here, there's no restriction on that story. You simply apply. You come for a 48-hour visit so that you can case the joint, as it were, and the people here can see you. And our life is really what we wish to make it. The only obligation is to go to chapel at 10 o'clock each weekday morning for matins, and then the rest of the time we're completely free.
There are two orders of St. Cross. The brothers of Henry de Blois' order dress in black. Those in purple belong to a more recent order.
In the 15th century, in fact this year, we're commemorating the 550th anniversary of the founding by another Bishop of Winchester, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, and he was also Chancellor of England. He was much more powerful than the king. In fact, at one point, he took the royal crown at pawn to lend money to the king. So there. He was surrounded, as Chancellor, by what we could call now higher civil servants, the Sir Humphreys, I suppose. And he wanted them to live in that setting in their last years, because the hall, chapel, and buildings are just like an Oxbridge College.
Who we got there, John?
Thank you.
A token sum of money is still doled out each week as a reminder of the welfare the brothers have received for 700 years. It is no accident that the most dominating feature in Winchester is the cathedral. There has been a church or minster on this site since the 7th century, when the early Wessex kings realised the importance of linking government with God. The outline of the old minster, which existed at the time of Alfred the Great, has been marked out alongside the present cathedral. By the time of Alfred, Winchester's minster had enjoyed cathedral status for more than 200 years. This was the religious heart of the kingdom, and remained so until Edward the Confessor, the last king to be crowned here. The most important religious ceremony for any sovereign in Britain is the coronation. Amazingly, Queen Elizabeth II's coronation service in 1953 was much the same as Edward the Confessor's in 1051. Yet the origins of the service are even older. Many of the rites and elements were created by Archbishop Dunstan when he crowned King Edgar some 80 years before Edward.
When Dunstan drafted the coronation, he wanted basically to achieve 5 things. To start with, he had the shout of recognition. And right at the beginning of the service, the Archbishop would say, "Here is this man, do you accept him?" And there would have been a great cheer, which was the recognition that he was the man. But they wanted, before they gave him all the power he needed, to ensure that he was controlled. To do that, they had the oath. And then the king, having made his oath to the people, would prepare himself for the greatest gift the church could give, which was the unction. To do that, he prostrated himself on the ground. He was, to some extent, left, as it were, for dead, and he would then rise up, dressed as simply as he could in the robes of a Byzantine peasant, ready for being elevated to this high point of office. Then he would be anointed. At this point, the church has given him everything they possibly can, and on behalf of the state, the archbishop then gave to the king the symbols of his authority. This was the fourth part, the investiture. But before the investiture began, they sang the anthem Zadok the priest. Now, Dunstan was a clever man. He chose this part of theology quite sensibly because he wanted to make sure that everyone remembered it was a priest who made the king. So after the investiture of crown, rod of state, and sword of power, he would then be entitled to ask for the one thing the king needs, and that was homage in return. And then all his peers and nobles and the church were ready to do homage to him.
Edgar fulfilled Alfred's dream by uniting the whole kingdom of England and creating one peaceful nation. His coronation was symbolic of this achievement and more, for he changed the meaning of loyalty to the crown. And no longer was it a pagan tribal instinct, but he made it a Christian obligation and introduced for the first time the idea of national patriotism. It was during Edgar's reign that Old Minster was reformed to a monastery known as St Swithin's Priory. Swithin was the bishop in the time of Alfred's father and grandfather, and probably played a significant role supporting the House of Wessex. He is credited with rebuilding the bridge over the Itchen and performing a miracle. He met a woman who had dropped and broken her basket of eggs, yet when he picked it up and gave it back to her, not a single egg was broken. However, the saint is probably best known for his association with the weather, and this stems from the story that he asked to be buried in a humble tomb outside Old Minster. But in July 971, they exhumed his body and ceremonially brought him inside the minster, at which point a dreadful storm occurred. And ever since, legend says that if it rains on St Swithin's Day, it will rain for the next 40. Winchester Cathedral is a royal burial site, and as such, it avoided the worst excesses of the Reformation under Henry VIII. However, it did not escape entirely. At 3 o'clock, one morning in September 1538, one of Henry's arch henchmen, Thomas Wriothesley, led a small band who smashed St Swithin's shrine and removed his bones in case they became the cause of veneration. From this moment, the saint's bones have never been seen again. Winchester Cathedral was actually the cause of another scene of destruction. The present cathedral was largely built by the Normans, yet before construction could begin, the bishop, Walklin, couldn't agree with the king, William I, how much timber was required. The bishop persuaded the king to let him take as much timber from the nearby royal hunting forest of Hampage as he could cut in 4 days. He then amassed an army of carpenters and stripped the forest bare. He left just one tree, the Gospel Oak as it's known, because this is a place it was said that the Gospel was first read in Wessex. The king was understandably furious, and it's thought Walklin was forced to do penance in sackcloth before he was forgiven. It's also a very good reason why, just a few miles to the south, William the Conqueror established a new forest. It was in this new forest that William's unpopular son, William Rufus, was shot while hunting. The rest of the hunting party fled and left the body in the middle of the forest. Prince Henry, Rufus's younger brother, also fled, but straight to Winchester and seized control of the treasury and the exchequer, and within 3 days was crowned king. Eventually, Rufus's body was also brought to Winchester. Under the cover of darkness, it was carried into the cathedral, and to the sounds of revelry celebrating Henry I's succession outside, they buried William II inside. Traditionally, this tomb is said to be that of William Rufus, and it was his burial here which was to blame when the central tower of the cathedral collapsed in 1107, 7 years after his death. Locals believed it was bad luck to bury such an unpleasant man in so sacred a place. The fact that this essentially Norman construction is still standing is something of a surprise, for it's built over a former marsh, and even now during winter time the water table rises so high as to flood the crypt. At the beginning of the century, though, parts of the cathedral seemed in danger of collapsing and needed to be underpinned. A deep-sea diver, William Walker, was called in and by hand replaced the raft of beach logs with bags of cement concrete. It took him 6 years to complete the work, and King George V and Queen Mary attended the service of thanksgiving for the workers and especially the diver who saved the cathedral. Along with government and worship, the third element of Alfred the Great's foundation in Winchester was a place of learning. His patronage of literature and his personal involvement with the translation of Latin books and texts into English are further examples of this remarkable king's many talents. It isn't just the translation of the books, but the illumination of these works which is so special. Some of the best examples are invariably Bibles, and this Winchester Bible, albeit 12th century, is a perfect specimen of the local style of illumination.
There was always a sense of partnership between the crown and the people under God. In these illuminations, the crown, through its patronage, has enabled the church to portray the word of God in a more glorious way. But also the political power of the crown is increased by its spiritual depiction in these biblical illustrations.
The notion of learning was further developed in the late 14th century, when the then Bishop William Wykeham founded Winchester College. After the Black Plague had decimated the population, Wykeham was dismayed at the standard of new recruits entering the church's ministry. He established 2 places of learning, primarily for young priests. One was New College, Oxford, the other Winchester College. Winchester was unique, for it was the first time that scholarships were offered. There are still places for 70 scholars, although the admission process has altered slightly. Since 1857, there's been a competitive examination. Before that, a scholar merely had to prove to have a wealthy patron. Remarkably simple when you consider that a scholarship ensured automatic admission to New College, Oxford, and essentially security for life. Winchester College was established by a royal charter in October 1382 by Richard II. Amazingly, it is still using many of its original buildings, which are at least 600 years old, and has the longest continuous history of any school in the country. One of the longest written accounts of English history is contained in a remarkable collection of books known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Of all Alfred's accomplishments, this history of the Kingdom of Wessex, which he commissioned, must be his greatest surviving legacy. The Chronicle provides us with an amazing year-by-year account of Alfred's and his successors' reigns, right up until the Norman invasion. Edward the Confessor's long and largely uneventful reign was later regarded with nostalgia. Yet his only real achievement was the construction of what became known as Westminster Abbey, which is where he was buried. Little did he know it was to change the fortunes of Winchester irreparably. His greatest crime, though, was to leave the matter of succession undecided. He was married, but with no children. His death in January 1066 was to set in motion a struggle for the English crown, which was to change the course of this land's history forever. In September 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, later nicknamed the Conqueror, landed at Pevensey Bay. William disputed King Harold's right to the throne and claimed that Edward had promised him the crown. The Battle of Hastings was to ultimately determine the fate of both the crown and the country. Then, on Christmas Day 1066, William symbolically held his coronation in Edward the Confessor's recently completed Westminster Abbey. It was the beginning of the transference of power from the ancient Saxon capital of Winchester to the new Norman one of London. As Winchester's status changed through the Middle Ages, so did the city. Its economy suffered, much of its Saxon heritage disappeared, and then in 1642, disaster struck. The outbreak of the Civil War divided the city's loyalties between the King, Charles I, and Parliament. But it was the latter's Roundhead soldiers who did the most damage. They looted the city and cathedral not once, but twice. And then, in September 1645, from the area known as Oliver's Battery, they turned their guns on the castle and pounded it for a week. Oliver Cromwell declared that Winchester Castle should never again pose a threat, and its remaining fortifications were torn down. Only the Great Hall survived. With only the Norman Cathedral and Plantagenet Great Hall left standing, it would seem that Winchester has been purged of its ancient past. Yet there is something here which opens up another world, a life beyond King Alfred, where fact meets fiction, the Round Table. No one seems to know just how it came to be here, but everyone associates it with and cannot help to be inspired by the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
If he existed at all, he would have lived in the 6th century, and he helped to basically weld together a number of feuding Celtic tribes to organize an opposition to the invading Saxons. So in fact, he's a very important figure for that reason. No one really knows about his death. He disappears under mysterious circumstances. And right from that moment onward, people were saying that this man, Arthur, will come back. Arthur will come back to help us in our time of need. And I think this became the beginning of the romantic legend. From the Middle Ages onward, there's been a very strong association, which still exists to this day, that this was the original, in some way connected to the original Round Table, that this was the original Camelot. This Round Table here, of course, is not the Round Table. This is a medieval copy, possibly made for Edward I. It was painted at the command of Henry VIII for the visit of the Emperor Charles V. And he desired to have it painted to capture the whole idea and spirit of Arthurian chivalry. But of course, the figure of Arthur is in fact Henry himself.
Henry probably inherited this fascination with Arthur from his father. Henry's father was Henry VII, but his claim to the English throne was tenuous beyond belief. So he used the magic of the Arthurian legend to assist his position and image. Henry named his eldest son Arthur and had him christened here at Winchester Cathedral, probably at this font. It was this Arthur who died before he became king and whose widow Catherine of Aragon married his brother, who later became Henry VIII. When Henry VIII had the table painted in 1522, it was to impress the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Henry had high hopes of securing the position of Holy Roman Emperor for himself, and wanted to suggest to Charles that his lineage could be traced as far back as the legendary hero and all that Arthur stood for. Where better to bring him than Winchester? Trying to prove your lineage or history is longer than someone else's is a practice which continues to this day. Britain is lucky to have such a rich, varied and relatively well-documented history, much of it encapsulated in this city of Winchester, the capital of the ancient kingdom of Wessex and the former capital of England. Many years ago, this used to be a little fishing village called Brightonston, and quite possibly it would never be much more than that today if it wasn't for the fancy of one of my more flamboyant ancestors, who constructed an amazing palace here, in its day the most expensive house in the world. It was his consuming passion, and over a period of 30 years he built it, ostensibly to escape the constraints of court life in London. In so doing, he gave Brighton a unique entry in the history books. Strangely enough, the Crown's connection with Brighton actually started some 130 years before the Royal Pavilion was ever conceived. It's thought to have happened right here, or rather I should say, up there. Charles II was on the run from Cromwell's army in 1651, after the execution of his father Charles I and his own defeat at the Battle of Worcester. But did he hide up this tree? Well, there are masses of pubs called the Royal Oak to mark the place where he's supposed to have hidden, and there are hundreds of trees which he's supposed to have climbed, so we're not actually sure. But we do know that this is the oldest tree in Brighton, and he was certainly in the town before making good his escape to Fécamp in France. Charles crossed the Channel on board a ship, the Surprise, owned by Nicholas Tattersall, having paid him £60 to ensure his safety. After Charles's restoration in 1660, Tattersall sought further awards for his valiant efforts and sailed his boat right up the Thames to Westminster. Who knows what powers of persuasion he used, but the result was a pension of £100 a year, with which he bought this pub, the Old Ship, the oldest hostelry in the town. However, it was the attractions of the seafront which were to change the entire history of the town. In the 1790s, a famous doctor of the day, Richard Russell, had declared salt water to be good for the body. Brightonston soon became highly fashionable as a spa and health resort, even attracting royalty. Prince George, eldest son of George III, was just one patient advised by his physicians to take the draughts of salubrious seawater, along with a concoction of milk, cream of tartar, crab's eyes, skin of viper, and prepared woodlice, as a healing potion for the glandular swellings on his neck. Yet one short visit for medicinal purposes turned into a lifelong love affair with the place.
Well, I think what attracted George to Brighton were several things. One was that he wanted to get away from London and his father and Windsor, where he felt rather hemmed in by all protocol. There were qualities that George III and George IV both shared, but they had very different attitudes to the day-to-day running of their lives, in that George III certainly put duty before pleasure on almost every occasion, and the Prince of Wales certainly put pleasure before duty on many occasions. Another was that Brighton was growing because it was growing into a fashionable seaside resort for the people who had something wrong with them, and he did have a problem with his glands. But even more than that, I think it was because his uncle, the Duke of Cumberland, invited him to come and stay 3 weeks after his 21st birthday, and it was just a wonderful excuse to get away and be informal.
Away from the restrictions of court, Brighton gave the Prince of Wales a whole range of amusements: sport, gambling, horse racing, hunting, riding. There was a distinctly racy, even risque atmosphere to the South Coast town, and of course there was another major attraction.
The Prince of Wales was attracted to ladies throughout his life. He tended to fall in love rather devotedly and passionately. He wasn't, I think, an exploiter of innocent girls, but he certainly changed the person with whom he was in love fairly regularly. Mainly they were either actresses or members of the aristocracy, and it was an enjoyable game. He didn't settle on one particular person until later, when he met the great love of his life, Mrs. Fitzherbert.
George was completely won over by Brightonston and returned often, but as a result of a deal with Parliament, he ended up buying a farmhouse here. By the time he had reached 21, the Prince had already managed to incur significant debts. Parliament agreed to clear the slate and pay him an annual allowance of £50,000 as a sort of coming-of-age present, with a further £12,000 a year from the Duchy of Cornwall. For his part, George sold his racehorses and moved to Brighton with his secret wife, Maria Fitzherbert, and promised faithfully to live within his means from now on. Let's make no mistake about it, there is no way that this was ever built within those means. The sums of money may seem enormous, especially for those days, but the idea of the Crown doing a deal with Parliament was certainly nothing new. It's been going on for centuries. Indeed, the very notion of a Parliament came about through a deal with the Crown, and that occurred 8 miles away. The Priory at Lewes was where a treaty was signed between the then King Henry III and the reformer Simon de Montfort, leader of the barons, way back in 1264. The Mise of Lewes, as it became known, was one of the earlier steps in the long road towards British parliamentary democracy. Its roots were in the dissatisfaction the barons felt towards their king.
They just thought that Henry had been an awful king. He ruled incredibly badly. He'd given lots and lots of favour to foreign relatives. He'd had an absurd scheme to put his second son on the throne of Sicily. He just didn't know how to be a king. And so what the magnates, the great barons, thought in that situation was, they thought, given the total incompetence of this king, we have a duty on behalf of really everybody else, on behalf of what they called the community of the realm, to place restrictions on him. And what that duty was to choose the king's ministers for him, to impose a council on him, and really to govern England in the king's name themselves. So that was really what the issue was here at Lewes in 1264. It was fundamentally the magnates saying, we should govern when the king is incompetent.
Perhaps not surprisingly, the king was less than enthusiastic about such a proposal. Indeed, considerable blood was spilt and lives lost over the issue. Lewes seemed an ideal place for Henry to make a stand. Its proximity to the south coast meant that the king's hoped-for reinforcements from France would not have far to come. Also, the county of Sussex was essentially loyal to the crown, and his brother Richard commanded the castle, and with it the rights of way over the South Downs. De Montfort set out from London with the principal aim of reaching the king's army before any possible reinforcement. He arrived here at the village of Fletching on the evening of May 13, 1264. Before resting up for the night, everyone was ordered to sew white crosses onto their battle dress to signify whose side they were on. And here in the churchyard, he dubbed 2 new knights. De Montfort then spent the rest of the evening and much of the night here in the church, praying for strength for the next day. His vigil would be rewarded. At first light, they headed southward towards Lewes. 2 miles north of the town, De Montfort was faced with a dilemma: to take the tactical route along the riverbank, or the riskier, more open approach over Opham Hill. He chose the latter. Meanwhile, the king's army was in the town relaxing, confident that their rivals were miles away. De Montfort's gamble paid off. The Baron's forces achieved the most important factor: surprise. Standing on the top of Opham Hill, they were able to look down on town, king, and army. The king's eldest son, Edward, later Edward I, Conqueror of Wales and Hammer of the Scots, tried to regain the initiative. Rallying his choice knights, he instructed them to follow him up the hill on horseback. The rest of the Royal Army gathered, the Prince's cavalry charge was in full flow. smashed into the Baron's forces at the top of a hill. The right flank, made up of luckless London foot soldiers, broke ranks and fled, hotly pursued by the cavalry. But in so doing, the horsemen took themselves out of the field of battle. By the time they wheeled back towards Lewes, it was already too late. The Baron's forces gradually advanced down the hill, step by step, towards the Royal Army. The fighting was piecemeal, hand to hand. The Royal Army, forced to fight uphill and unable to hold on, was eventually split. Henry's brother, Prince Richard, was cut off from the main army. He fled the battlefield and tried to escape by hiding in a nearby windmill. He was soon found by de Montfort's men, surrounded, and eventually surrendered. That really forced King Henry's hand. With his brother under threat of death, he withdrew to his base here at the Priory and finally capitulated. It took just one day and claimed at least 1,500 lives. Many of de Montfort's dead were brought back here to Fletching to be buried. It may seem a high price to pay, but the Battle of Lewes was to help shape the constitutional future of England.
In the first place, it was utterly radical and revolutionary, because what it meant was that Simon de Montfort governed England in the King's name all the way through till his appalling death at the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. And he was the first magnate, therefore, the first great baron to actually seize power and govern England in the King's name. No one else does that until Oliver Cromwell. It's extraordinarily revolutionary, but of course temporary, because it all ends with the Battle of Evesham. I think the second constitutional significance there is much more long-term, and in a sense we're still living with it today, and that is Parliament. Because you see, Simon de Montfort was the first person to actually summon something which you could call the House of Commons in Embryo. To his famous Parliament in January 1265, he summoned representatives from the counties, knights from the counties, and burgesses from the boroughs. And they met at that Parliament for 3 months, between January, February, March 1265. And that really is the first occasion when anything like the House of Commons can be said to have met. So you see, when people scoff and say Simon de Montfort wasn't the founder of the House of Commons, it's not entirely true. In many ways he was. That's the first. It sets a precedent, a pattern for the future, and later kings repeat it again and again until the House of Commons becomes finally completely established. So in a way we are still living with the consequences of the Battle of Lewes today.
There is little evidence to show of this historic battle site, save for the odd clue dotted around Lewes. What does remain from those days, however, is the magnificent Lewes Castle. The importance of the castle can be quickly grasped by looking at the view across the downs and, more significantly, the valley. Lewes controls one of the few passes over the South Downs. When William de Warenne built this castle soon after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, it totally dominated the area. De Warenne married Gundrada, whom some believe was William the Conqueror's daughter, and together they founded the Priory. It is dedicated to St Pancras, and its style is based on the abbey at Cluny in France. Hardly anything of the Priory, which dates back to the days of William the Conqueror, now remains. It was largely destroyed by Cromwell, and many of the stones were then taken by locals to build their own houses in the town or adorn the gardens of buildings like the splendid Grange. In the south chapel of the nearby church of St John the Baptist lies Gundrada's tomb. Just across the street is an early 16th century timber-framed Wealdon Hall house. Known as Anne of Cleves House, Henry VIII gave it to his fourth wife as part of her divorce settlement, but she never actually lived here. Given its rather macabre legend, that is perhaps not surprising. The story goes that it was to here that the knights who murdered Thomas à Becket in Canterbury Cathedral came. They arrived in the middle of the night, having ridden the 70-odd miles from the scene of their heinous crime. They flung off their helmets and tunics splattered with blood onto this table. But legend has it that their garments were somehow thrown off the table, not once, but 3 times. The merging of history and modern-day custom could not be more brilliantly illustrated than here in Lewes on November the 5th. This is the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot, when Guy Fawkes was discovered attempting to blow up the Houses of Parliament and the then King James I in 1605. And the scenes out here are quite amazing. The custom of lighting bonfires and burning effigies on this date takes on a particular significance in Lewes. In the 1550s, during Queen Mary I's attempts to restore the Roman Catholic faith to England, 17 Protestants became martyrs when they were burnt at the stake here. There must be at least 50,000 people out there tonight. Yet such scenes as these serve to remind us of our turbulent past and even a warning for our future. History doesn't relate whether or not the future George IV ever witnessed such scenes himself. But he is known to have come here.
This street in Lewes shows something of the character of Prince George, the Prince Regent. The story goes that he was dared to drive a coach and horses down here, Keir Street, which must be one of the steepest streets in the whole of England.
Whether he actually made it is not recorded, but knowing his love of a bet and the fact that he was an excellent horseman, I fully expect he gave it a go. George loved horses and riding. He's known to have raced himself and owned many racehorses. That must have added to the attraction of this part of the country for him. But unfortunately he had to give up all that as part of his deal with Parliament. This is the old farmhouse the Prince Regent bought. Parliament could hardly have had this in mind when they tried to curb his spending. All that's left of the original farm cottage are these rooms. The low ceilings and odd proportions, the only clues to what was once here. The rest has just been added on over a period of 35 years. It is fairly lavish. I mean, how much did this sort of thing cost?
Lavish, my word, yes. Understatement almost. Fortunes. It is rumoured that the Prince spent altogether approximately £750,000 on the entire Royal Pavilion. Now, if you put that into context with the average yearly income of about £80 a year, and that was a good salary, that sort of gives you an idea of what this cost. The light fitting in the centre, this stunning lamp behind us, That is reputed to have cost £5,500, just the one light fitting.
And what were the sort of innovations about the house? I mean, it was a real sort of statement of the day.
Not only a fashion statement of the day, but also fantasy and reality always meet here. And that's the wonderful thing about the building. So yes, I agree with you, fashion statement, yes. But on the other hand, you had most modern things, cast iron structure inside the building, holding the building up. The staircases, for instance, that look as if made of bamboo, are made of cast iron, cast in one place. It's a stunning bit of workmanship. Most people walk past it. So, by the way, there's the cast iron staircase, with, of course, a mahogany handrail, again imitating bamboo. Quite wonderful. The kitchens were the most modern kitchens for their time. That was state-of-the-art kitchens. To have a kitchen next to a dining area, closed in ranges, the funnel ceiling, hot and cold running water. Dinner was served service à la française, served by footmen, brand new thinking. And the table, in fact, here is set out for the dessert course of a meal. And if I tell you that George had the ice imported for the ice creams for the dessert from the United States, 2/3 of the cargo would actually melt en route. I mean, you ask about the cost, just that sort of thing alone. Ice was then stored in ice houses, of course, but when the ice cream arrived, this was the ultimate fashion statement. This man knows something, even chilled the desserts. Wonderful.
Now, why the Indian and the Chinese influence? Why was that so important?
It was chic. Exoticism was chic throughout the Western world. But to have an entire Indian building stroke Chinese is rare and is not liked by everyone. Not then, not now. Not the quality of the workmanship, superb, always, but the way it looks.
So lots of people from all over Europe used to come here and were entertained here, were they? I mean,
indeed, this was an international fashion spot. George was the fashion maker in Europe.
And George was a musician himself, but he was very fond of music, wasn't he?
Loved music. Music was one of his great passions. He was one of the greatest further of the arts, full stop. He played cello beautifully. It is said that he sang with enthusiasm, but not that much talent, but certainly had a massive orchestra, 40, a wonderful music room which took 2 years to build, 37 men working night and day, and it is said, when he first saw the finished project, he was so touched by its beauty, he was touched to tears.
How did he manage to pay for all this? I mean, especially when he was in debt, how did he pay off some of his bills?
He had very extraordinary and colorful ways of settling certain bills. There's a story of his solicitor demanding money, like now, the man needs the money, and George's response was to send him a portrait of himself.
When George IV died in 1830, he had a picture of Mrs. Fitzherbert around his neck and a letter from her under his pillow. He made his last visit to Brighton 3 years earlier, which was the only time that he saw the completed pavilion. From then on, Brighton was never really the same. His niece, Queen Victoria, was not very fond of it. Brighton had become a popular seaside town and the pavilion far too public. When she built Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, she sold this amazing legacy of an extravagant age to the town in 1850. And so the royal connection with Brighton came to an end.